Hi, all. It's Mrs. Chow. As I'm going to be out for a little bit, I figured wanted to make sure we get through material so that you didn't feel uncomfortable leading up to the midterm. So to continue forward with that curriculum, I'm going to do a combination of things that would essentially be the same as what we were doing in class. Well, I'll post notes as well as I will post videos of me walking you through some of those notes. Thus far, we have covered in most classes, sorry, first period, the Russia intro. We did that before break. I posted those notes. And I'd already mentioned to first period that you'd be responsible for those. We have the history notes, which I posted yesterday on Google Classroom with the notes itself for the course. So those two are up. That's the first and third set of slides for Russia. So today I'm going to post a video of me walking you through the second set of notes, looking at some background info. It's not an extensive amount of information. So for Monday's quiz, we're looking at the material you're responsible for being the first, second, and third set of notes. So essentially by today, you will have all of the notes that are necessary for the quiz. So if you have any questions or concerns, you can email me. That is going to be the best way to communicate with me right now is via email. So if you have questions or concerns, please make sure that you email me. So let's get started on some background info on the Russian Federation. So one of the things we really need to think about in Russia is how are we going to classify this government? Is it an authoritarian oligarchy? Is it budding democracy? In the early 1990s, when we have the fall of the Soviet Union, there are great hopes that this is going to be a budding democracy. But in reality, we see a very different type of government structure coming about. On paper, it looks like a democracy, but in reality, it's this more authoritarian oligarchy that comes about. So between 1945 and 1991, we see global politics being defined by the Cold War, by this competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, democracy and communism, between capitalism and a command economy. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, it left the Russian Federation as the largest piece of territory that was remaining from that union of Soviet socialist republics. And the Russian Republic becomes that independent Russian Federation. Its population was cut in half, but it still remained the largest country in the world in terms of geographic size, which we've already covered. Boris Yeltsin, who at the time when the Soviet Union still existed, he was the leader of the Russian Republic, that entity within the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union itself was led by Mikhail Gorbachev. So Yeltsin now finds himself the leader of an independent Russian Federation. And almost overnight, we see him initiating what becomes known as the shock therapy reforms, because it's like clear, we're going to shock the system of the old Soviet Union, creating this Russian Federation. And it's almost overnight democracy people had not been exposed to in decades and decades and decades. And let's also be very honest, prior to the Communist Party coming into power in 1917 with the revolution, we ultimately have a czarist regime in place. So do the Russians have any experience whatsoever with democracy? Not really. So we look at this oligarchy that emerges in the 1990s. The West had so much faith, had so much hope invested in Boris Yeltsin when he initiates these shock therapy reforms. He's named Time Man of the Year. They think, oh, he's going to be this hero for democracy and capitalism. But unfortunately, we see an oligarchy actually rising up during those years of Yeltsin's reign. And that's because because Yeltsin suffered from a lot of health issues, including alcoholism. And because of that, he was really left in a position where he was not capable of making all of those big political decisions himself. So we see a small group of Yeltsin's family members, including his daughter, and some personal advisors like business leaders, taking control of the government and granting themselves favors, inviting political and economic corruption. So unfortunately, with these hopes that are pinned to Yeltsin, they're really being dashed because of the issues that Yeltsin is ultimately facing. Now, Yeltsin serves 2 terms as president, but he doesn't finish that second term. Again, he had very erratic behaviors because of his health concerns. He went through a couple of different prime ministers. As we'll talk about later on, the Russian Federation is set up as this hybrid semi-presidential, like part presidential, part parliamentary system. So they have a president in Boris Yeltsin, but they also have an appointed prime minister. So Yeltsin goes through a couple of different prime ministers, and by the middle of 1999, he's looking at needing another prime minister. And that's where we see the rise of Vladimir Putin. Putin comes in the middle of 99, in August of 99, as his new prime minister. As I had referenced in class, Putin's rise to power was really historic. He was the head of the FSB, the Federal Security Bureau, which is like the US's CIA. The FSB in Russia is the successor organization to the KGB. So it went KGB, FSB. So Putin becomes the head of the FSB, but people really didn't know him. And so we ultimately see Putin being tapped to be this prime minister. People didn't really know who this new guy was. But from August until December, he serves as Yeltsin's prime minister. And by the end of December of 1999, Yeltsin has resigned. Putin has taken over as the new president of the Russian Federation. And we're going to see changes being implemented pretty quickly under Putin's reign. Now, the deal that was struck was a fairly shady backdoor deal. Yeltsin saying like, hey, I'll step down now before my term is over. That'll place you in a much better position, Vladimir, to win the next election. You will serve as acting president, which Vladimir Putin did once Yeltsin stepped down. And the idea was that in Russia, their constitution, they have to hold new elections within 3 months of a president no longer being able to serve in that capacity. So they weren't going to wait for the actual election to take place later in 2000. It would have to take place in March of 2000. And it did on March 26, 2000. And Putin handily won that election. People saw him as someone with strength. Russians tend to gravitate towards very strong, charismatic leaders, and if nothing else, Putin is definitely that. He exudes strength. Immediately, we see him containing the power of the oligarchs. Now, you might think, oh, this is going to be great for Russia. They'll actually start developing towards this democratic regime, which they are on paper according to their constitution. But that's not the case. He wants to control the oligarchs. He doesn't want them to have power because essentially he wants to have all power himself. So we start to see this centralization of power in the hands of the president, which again at this point is Putin. We see this movement towards authoritarian rule. Some will refer to Russia as either a semi-authoritarian regime or an illiberal democracy. I think I also threw out to you guys that sometimes it's referred to as a competitive authoritarian regime because they still hold elections, but it's becoming more and more authoritarian in nature. We see this greater unpredictability of Russia because there's no experience with democracy. There's no experience with free market economy. And that's why we see this Putin really wanting to centralize power. So there's greater stability. And the Russian people tend to be okay with this during these years because of their strong Slavic background. Those Slavic roots really provides a tendency to autocratic rule. And that's what the Russians were used to seeing. So again, what type of government is it? As I was referencing, it's a hybrid presidential parliamentary regime or a semi-presidential regime. People would also call it a hybrid democratic authoritarian regime. It falls somewhere in the middle, right? Semi-authoritarian, illiberal democracy, competitive authoritarian regime. We'll talk about how later on in the unit, how they have a bicameral legislature. And because Russia likes to be the exception to many rules, they have a federal system, but they're asymmetric federal, which means that the central government does not devolve powers to the various regions of Russia symmetrically. It doesn't divide them up evenly. You'll see some regions of Russia having way more autonomy than other regions of Russia, hence the asymmetric piece. So we look here, sovereignty, authority, and power. Most of the 20th century in the Soviet Russia, we see sovereignty, authority, power really in the hands of the Politburo of the Communist Party. The Politburo is this small group of men who had worked their way up through the ranks of the party. Remember, this is a communist regime, so they're supposed to be at the core of this regime a sense of egalitarianism, a sense of equality. And so we see that here with the Politburo. It wasn't equal for everyone getting into the party. It wasn't equal status party of the Soviet Union. You had to know someone, you had to have some pull somehow. But once you got into the party, there was a greater sense of egalitarianism where you could work your way up through the ranks using your wits, using your intelligence, your wherewithal, whatever experience, whatever like craftiness you ultimately had. And you could become a leader. This was called the nomenclatura system. So this nomenclatura system is this ordered path from the local party Soviets, where you'd sort of enter into the party, up to the commanding heights of leadership. And we're going to see this example of a nomenclatura system later on when we get to China as well. China will use a very similar sort of egalitarian, work your way up through the system idea as well. When the Soviet Union dissolved, though, the authority and power of the Politburo obviously dissolved with it. As they were no longer communist, the Politburo, which was a communist entity, a communist institution, was no longer going to have that power. So, where do we see legitimacy coming from? Political legitimacy for Russia tends to currently be fairly low, partly because of the changes that are being instituted, drastic departure from their past. But there has been some recent evidence that the country is stabilizing under Vladimir Putin and his strength. A sense of stability for Russia, which has had a lot of chaos, especially right after the fall of the Soviet Union and with the presidency of Boris Yeltsin. Putin has been using authoritarian strategies to solidify Russia's weak, illiberal democracy and really solidifying that for himself and his own power. I've referenced constitutional reforms that took place this year. Well, now it's last year in 2020 to allow Putin to serve 4 terms as president rather than 2 terms like other Russian presidential candidates would have the opportunity. Historically, Russia's political legitimacy has been based on strong, centralized autocratic rule. You've got the czars, you've got communist rule that was propagated by Marxist Leninist thought. Um, when we talk about Vladimir Lenin, we really talk about that idea of democratic centralism, rule by the few for the benefit of the many. Um, Lenin, it's believed, truly espoused that idea. He wanted to see the people being put forward and their needs being met by the government, but he felt like there was only a small group of people that could really fulfill those needs, that not everyone should really have that say. Stalinism, though, changed the regime from this direction of democratic centralism to one of totalitarianism. And for the Russians, unfortunately, that becomes the model, and really for the rest of the world, that, that Stalinist totalitarian version of communism is what becomes the model of communism around the world. So um, but we see, okay, czars are in and out, the communists are in for a long time, many decades, but then they're out by 1991. So we have this attempt at a democracy, and with a democracy, you typically are going to see a constitution. So the Constitution of 1993 comes about, and it gives legitimacy to that new Russian Federation and to Yeltsin's regime. Provided for a strong president, which again, they gravitate towards strong leaders, so that should make sense. Although the power of the president can technically be checked by popular elections and the Duma. Unfortunately, we really haven't seen a president checked by the Constitution in a couple decades because of Putin. And there we have Putin as the superhero that he envisions himself, I'm sure, to be. Here we have a political cartoon, just some silliness here, here from the Sochi Olympics in 2014. And Putin claims another gold medal, this time in the four-man bobsled. He does not need four men because he is a Superman. And then here we have another cartoon, unfortunately, where we see some Eastern European countries along with Russia that are trampling on democracy. And finally, here we have Putin acting like Putin riot. There is a punk band in Russia, an all-female punk band called Pussy Riot, and there's a great documentary on it called Pussy Riot: A Punk Prayer. But uh, we ultimately see the group, the actual punk band, they write songs and perform challenging Putin's power, but Putin does not take too kindly to that. And they were arrested, they were put in prison for a while. A lot of issues, became a big international incident actually at that point. And it's all because he's taking justice and all of that in his own hands. So now we're going to go through some of the aspects of their political culture. There will be a slide on each of these points here. So talking about beliefs and attitudes, there is mistrust of the government. Russians have a tendency to feel like they can't trust their government. It's a result of the treatment and government secrecy that existed during Tsarist Russia, during the Soviet regimes. But ironically, at the same time that there's this mistrust of government, there also tends to be this idea, this belief in statism. And statism exists despite this mistrust, where Russian citizens still expect the state to take a very active role in their lives. So even though they don't trust the government, they expect the government to take an active role in their lives. This has never made any sense to me, but I am an American with a Western attitude. I have spoken to some of my former Russian students, and they say, no, it doesn't really make sense, but to a Russian, it would make sense. So there we go. In terms of economic beliefs, nearly all groups and political factions today in Russia favor market reforms. Not all, but most, although not all do so enthusiastically. And then another piece of their culture we need to talk about in terms of beliefs and attitudes is Westernization. It's the conflict between Westernizer, right? So some political parties will emphasize nationalism, Russian interests, Slavic culture, while others will emphasize reform, and integration of Russia into the world economy and the global trade market and globalization. So there still is this challenge, this conflict between the two sides. Do we focus on the Slavic culture and the Slavophiles, or do we focus on greater integration? In terms of geographic setting, as we've mentioned, Russia is the largest country in the world. It contains 11 different time zones, which is insane. A majority of the country is north of the 49th degree latitude line, which is actually the US Canadian border. So most of that land, which is makes up the largest country in the world, is north of that US Canadian border. They have an abundance of natural resources that exist, but unfortunately, they exist in these inhospitable or inaccessible geographic locations. So it's not very easy for them to gain access to those resources, even though they know that they exist. They do try, obviously, and they're creating technologies in order to access those resources easier. The next piece here is Eastern Orthodoxy religion. So early in their history, Russians had established ties with Constantinople. They had adopted Eastern Orthodox Christianity as their religion. This meant that because they adopted Eastern Orthodoxy, they didn't share the values of the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment. Um, they were in that sort of Eastern Orthodox bubble. Russians came to value a strong state that was going to protect them from their geographic vulnerabilities instead of individualism. So individualism becomes a value in during the Renaissance and the Reformation time periods and those that followed afterwards in Western Europe. And it's not necessarily a value that Russians have adopted. Russian statism, as we were talking about before, existed in contrast to Western civil society. So the Russians expecting the government to take on a lot and do a lot for them, whereas in Western European society, you see the people having more of an influence, having more of a say. Eastern Orthodoxy also was linked with the state. Separation of church and state, therefore, did not exist in Russia until you have communist Russia, the communist Soviet Union coming about. Um, so during those hundreds of years, Russia really developed a sense of global mission that was linked to their self-proclaimed title as the bastions of Eastern Orthodoxy, of Eastern Christianity. They felt it was their mission to be spreading this idea of Eastern Orthodoxy. And this sense of global mission, where they feel like, oh, it's their responsibility, would then later be transferred as they start to promote communism. Um, so it's promoted by the Soviet Union and their spread and preservation of communism with this idea of like the Third International. So under the czars, we see the religion being Russian Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox. All religion, though, was prohibited during the Soviet Union's time, during from 1917 until the end of 1991. Boris Yeltsin, though, when he became president, he encouraged the Russian Orthodox Church to reestablish itself as the signal of a break from communism and a reflection of old Russian nationalism, saying, like, hey, let's really go forward, push forward with Russian Orthodoxy to really show the world that we are breaking ties with those old communist values. Other religions are represented in very small percentages in Russia, Roman Catholic, Jews, Muslims, Protestants. When we looked at the demographics, or if you looked at those slides, you have very small percentages overall of people identifying as practicing worshipers. But remember, that's the legacy of the Soviet Union, of communism. And we have the highest percentage being Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox, and then that next highest number being Muslim. Equality of result is another aspect of their political culture. The communist regime instilled this value of equality in the Russian people that was already strong in a country of peasants with very similar living standards. So you had a country like Russia was prior to communism that was fairly backwards. They had not industrialized. They had done so at a very slow pace. It's the reason why when they went into World War I, they were so ill-equipped to actually fight against their enemies. They did not have the industrialized status that would allow them to have all the weapons that would make them a real force to be reckoned with. So because they hadn't industrialized, you had this very agrarian society. And in these rural farming communities, people have very similar lifestyles and they work as a community to try to help one another. So when you have this transition to communism, we're ultimately seeing this sort of continuation of a sense of equality that had already existed. Egalitarianism has survived the fall of the Soviet Union. Most Russians will resent differences of wealth or income, although we know that some of the wealthiest people in the world now are Russians. Um, so we have this sort of conundrum of equality of result versus equality of opportunity. In Western society, you will typically see equality of opportunity. Give everyone equal footing, like, oh, everyone gets an education, and then what you do with that is up to you. Whereas in Russia, there's still tends to be, even though there's been a more push for equality of opportunity, there still tends to be today this greater acceptance of equality of result. That no matter what our opportunities are, we should get the same thing in return. And again, that's still part of this legacy from the communist years. Russian political culture is not particularly conducive to the development of capitalism. Um, and it's one of the reasons why it faltered during the 1990s. Then we see hostility towards government and nationality. I think it is an interesting image that I found when I was researching um, Russian government, and clearly it shows someone who looks hostile. Um, so despite strong central authority in Russian statism, citizens can be surprisingly hostile towards their government, again, because of this mistrust. Years of repression have sparked resentment that leads to bad-mouthing of political leaders. There's greater pessimism towards political and economic policies. Um, but this has changed a bit in the years of Putin. And then we also have here this importance of nationality. So there is a very heterogeneous population. And you have cultural heterogeneity existing. The Russians dominate within the Russian population itself. Again, that was in the demographics that we went over in those intro slides. And historically, there have been stereotypes and discrimination against these ethnic and national minorities. The Baltic peoples in Russia are usually viewed favorably, whereas the Muslim Turks are viewed in a more negative light. And anti-Semitism was very strong under the czars. Some nationalists in Russia today still blame the Jews for Russia's current problems. There's one Russian leader, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who has a lot of issues with a lot of different groups of people, but he is anti-Semitic and still believes that Jews are to blame for much of the problems that Russia faces today. And so we finally end here with some political and economic changes. Again, they went through this long period of autocratic rule by the czars. The control had passed down through the hands of the Romanov family. But that ended with the Russian Revolution in 1917. The 20th century ruled by Communist Party, where we go from 1917 all the way until the end of 1991, go through many leaders, but the most influential, I would say, are obviously Lenin as that revolutionary figure, and then Stalin, who really set the model for that totalitarian communist rule. And then we have the regime change to democracy and free market economy in 1991. Boris Yeltsin trying to put Western style reforms in place to help create this new Russian Federation. But unfortunately, as I referenced previously, his health issues really were a detriment to these changes coming about. And we see it's really Putin who brings about the stability through greater authoritarianism. So that is our background info on Russia. That is all of the slides for file number 2. So remember, we've got file 1, which is the intro slides. Now we've got this second file, which are the background info, and then the history slides that I posted yesterday. I am going to go through a couple of the history slides with you guys tomorrow. I'm not going to go through them all. Most of them you'll be responsible for yourself, but I'll make another video where I'll go through some of the history with you. And that is all of the material that you will be responsible for the quiz on Monday. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a good day. Make sure that you are telling your classmates, watch this video, go through the slides. Bye, y'all.